The sun was shining brightly in the clear blue sky as Mark Reynolds stood in his backyard, watching his granddaughter Lily run around with excitement. Today was her 5th birthday, and everything was set up perfectly. Colorful balloons danced in the wind. A big pink banner with "Happy Birthday Lily" stretched across the fence, and a bright yellow bounce house stood in the middle of the yard, already filled with laughing children. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air, making everyone's stomachs rumble. Mark rarely got a full day off from work. As an FBI agent, his job kept him busy, and his days were often filled with long hours, serious cases, and intense situations. But today was different. Today, he was just a grandfather who wanted to make his granddaughter's birthday special. His daughter, Emily, had planned the whole party, making sure everything was just the way Lily wanted. There were games, music, and even a table filled with cupcakes, cookies, and a giant birthday cake shaped like a unicorn, Lily's favorite. Family and friends had gathered to celebrate. Some of Mark's colleagues from work had also stopped by, bringing their kids along to join the fun. Laughter and cheerful voices filled the backyard as kids played tag, took turns on the bounce house, and tried to break open a colorful piñata shaped like a rainbow. Adults stood around chatting, enjoying their drinks, and sharing stories. It was the kind of day that made everyone feel happy and relaxed. Lily, wearing a sparkly pink dress and a matching birthday crown, ran up to her grandfather with a wide smile. "Grandpa, watch me jump," she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the bounce house. Mark chuckled, following her as she climbed inside and started bouncing up and down. "You're getting so high," he cheered, making her giggle with excitement. Seeing her so happy made everything worth it. Across the yard, Emily was helping the kids line up for a game of musical chairs when she suddenly noticed an older woman peeking through the curtains of the house next door. Emily sighed, recognizing the neighbor immediately. It was Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was known for keeping a close eye on everything and had a reputation for not liking loud noises. Emily knew she would not be happy about the music and laughter coming from their backyard. Still, Emily chose to ignore it for now. It was a special day, and they weren't doing anything wrong. After all, it was just a child's birthday party. She turned back to the kids, clapping her hands and starting the game. The music played, and the children giggled as they walked around the chairs, waiting for the music to stop so they could grab a seat. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. The noise was too much for her. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head. This wasn't acceptable. Someone needed to do something. Without another thought, she grabbed her phone, quickly dialing a number. "Hello, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said firmly. She had no idea what was about to happen next. The phone call was short, but Mrs. Carter made sure to sound serious. She explained to the police that there was a loud gathering next door, with music and shouting that was disturbing the peace. She didn't mention that it was a child's birthday party, only that the noise was too much and that it needed to be stopped. After hanging up, she folded her arms and continued watching from her window, waiting to see what would happen next. Back in the backyard, the party was still in full swing. The children were having the time of their lives, running around, playing games, and enjoying the delicious treats from the dessert table. Parents stood in small groups, chatting and laughing as they watched their kids. The sound of joy filled the air, but to Mrs. Carter, it was nothing but a disturbance. Lily was in the middle of opening her presents, her eyes lighting up with every gift she unwrapped. "Wow! A unicorn doll!" She squealed as she held up a soft plush toy. Everyone clapped and cheered for her, happy to see the little girl so excited. Mark stood nearby, smiling as he watched his granddaughter. These were the moments he treasured most, the rare times when he could just be a grandfather instead of an agent always focused on work. Just then, a car slowly pulled up in front of the house. Two uniformed police officers stepped out, looking around before walking toward the front door. A few guests noticed them first, their smiles fading into looks of confusion. Emily, standing near the dessert table, turned her head and frowned. "Why are the police here?" she murmured. Mark, noticing the sudden change in atmosphere, glanced toward the entrance. He had spent years working with law enforcement, and he recognized the way the officers approached, calm but firm, as if they were responding to a complaint. He exchanged a quick look with one of his colleagues, who raised an eyebrow in silent question. Something wasn't right. Emily wiped her hands on a napkin and walked toward the officers before they could knock. "Hello, officers. Is something wrong?" she asked politely, though a hint of concern was in her voice. One of the officers, a tall man with short dark hair, gave her a small nod. "We got a call about a noise disturbance coming from this address," he explained. "A neighbor reported loud music and shouting." Emily blinked in surprise. "Noise disturbance? But it's just a birthday party for my daughter," she said, gesturing toward the backyard. "The kids are just playing." The second officer, a younger man, glanced past her and saw the colorful decorations, the children running around, and the cake table filled with treats. He immediately realized what was going on. This wasn't a rowdy party. It was just a group of families celebrating. Mark decided to step forward, his presence immediately noticeable. "Officers," he said in a calm, steady voice, "I'm Special Agent Mark Reynolds with the FBI. This is my granddaughter's birthday party. We're just having a little fun." The officers exchanged glances. The situation had just taken an unexpected turn. The two officers stood still for a moment, processing what they had just heard. They had expected to handle a simple noise complaint, maybe talk to a few people, and then leave. But now they realized they were standing in front of an FBI agent's house, one who was clearly not pleased about the interruption. The taller officer, Officer Daniels, cleared his throat. "Special Agent Reynolds," he repeated, his eyebrows raising slightly. Mark gave a small nod. "That's right." His voice was calm, but there was a firmness behind it. "This is a private birthday party for my granddaughter. We're not causing any trouble." The younger officer, Officer Carter, looked past Mark again, taking in the sight of children laughing, parents talking, and the colorful decorations. He had been a police officer for a few years now, and he knew when a situation was serious and when it wasn't. This was definitely not a problem. Officer Daniels sighed, glancing at his partner before turning back to Mark. "We received a call about loud noise. We had to respond, but from what I can see, this is just a family gathering." Emily, still standing nearby, crossed her arms. "A neighbor called this in. Let me guess, it was Mrs. Carter." She didn't sound angry, just frustrated. Officer Carter hesitated before giving a small nod. "We can't say exactly who made the call, but, well, it was a noise complaint." Mark took a slow breath and looked toward the house next door. Through the curtains, he could see a small movement. Mrs. Carter was still watching. He wasn't angry at her, but he did find it disappointing that she had chosen to call the police instead of simply speaking to them. By now, the guests at the party had noticed the officers and were quietly watching the conversation. The kids, of course, were still busy playing, unaware that anything was happening. Mark turned back to the officers. "Well, since you're already here, would you like some cake?" His expression softened slightly, and there was even a hint of amusement in his voice. Officer Carter blinked, surprised by the unexpected offer. Officer Daniels, who had been a cop for a long time, chuckled. "That's a kind offer, Agent Reynolds, but we're on duty." Emily smiled, shaking her head. "It's really just a birthday party. We didn't mean to bother anyone." Daniels nodded. "No harm done. We'll just mark this down as a resolved complaint." He gave a small smile. "And happy birthday to your granddaughter." With that, the officers turned to leave. Mark walked them to the front, watching as they got into their patrol car and drove away. Inside her house, Mrs. Carter frowned, realizing that her call hadn't led to the outcome she had expected. She pulled back from the window, feeling a mix of emotions she wasn't quite ready to admit. Meanwhile, back at the party, Mark shook his head with a small sigh. Well, that was interesting. Emily laughed. Only in this neighborhood. The party continued, but everyone now knew this was far from over. The police officers had left, and the party slowly returned to normal. The children continued playing, laughing as they ran around the yard. Parents went back to chatting, though many still exchanged glances, shaking their heads about what had just happened. Mark, standing near the table with his cup of coffee, couldn't help but glance toward the neighbor's house again. He knew Mrs. Carter was still watching. Emily sighed as she sat down next to her father. I just don't understand, she said. Why didn't she just come talk to us instead of calling the police? Mark took a slow sip of his coffee, thinking. Some people just don't like change, he said. Maybe she's used to having the neighborhood quiet all the time. Maybe she doesn't like a lot of noise. But calling the police over a kid's birthday party, that's a bit much. Emily nodded in agreement. Lily was so excited for today. I'm just glad the police didn't shut the whole thing down. Mark chuckled. They didn't even take my offer for cake. Emily laughed at that, shaking her head. That was a nice touch, though. Maybe next time, we should send Mrs. Carter a cupcake before she calls the cops. Mark smiled but didn't say anything. Instead, he turned his attention back to his granddaughter, who was now excitedly getting ready for her big birthday wish. Everyone gathered around as Emily placed the giant unicorn-shaped cake on the table. The candles flickered as Lily's little hands clapped together in excitement. Make a wish, sweetheart, Emily said softly. Lily squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, then took a deep breath and blew out the candles. Everyone cheered, and the backyard filled with happy voices once again. But across the fence, Mrs. Carter was still standing by her window. She hadn't moved since the police left. Something about the way they handled the situation left her feeling unsettled. She had expected them to at least issue a warning, maybe even tell the family to turn down the noise. But instead, they had left with smiles and well wishes. She sighed, sitting down in her chair. She had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 30 years, and things had always been peaceful. No loud music, no shouting children, no big gatherings. But lately, everything had started to change. More young families were moving in, and with them came noise, laughter, and parties like this one. It wasn't bad, she supposed, but it was different. And different made her uncomfortable. For a moment, she considered stepping outside and saying something. Maybe just asking them to be quieter. But then she thought about what would happen if she did. Would they welcome her? Or would they see her as just the grumpy old neighbor? She sighed again, shaking her head. Outside, the party continued, and for the first time, Mrs. Carter felt like an outsider in her own neighborhood. The birthday party carried on, filling the air with laughter, music, and the happy chatter of children. Lily was now busy playing with her new toys while the adults enjoyed slices of cake and light conversation. The earlier visit from the police had already become just a funny story to share. But across the fence, Mrs. Carter was still sitting by her window, staring at the celebration with a frown. She wasn't angry, at least, not in the way she had been before. Instead, she felt something she couldn't quite explain. The party was loud, yes, but was it really that bad? The officers hadn't seemed to think so, and the way they had spoken to Mark, so respectful, even friendly, made her wonder if she had misjudged the situation. Mrs. Carter had lived in this neighborhood for decades. She had seen people come and go, had watched as homes were sold to younger families, bringing with them their energy, their children, and their noise. In her younger years, she had been more involved. She knew all her neighbors, had been invited to gatherings, and had even hosted a few herself. But as the years passed, things changed. The familiar faces moved away, and suddenly, she found herself surrounded by strangers. And now, looking at the party, she realized something. She had never really tried to get to know Mark's family. She had been so focused on keeping things the way they used to be that she had pushed away the very people who could have made her feel less alone. A small knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, then slowly got up and opened it. Standing there was Emily, holding a small plate with a slice of birthday cake. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," Emily said with a gentle smile. "I thought you might like some cake. It's Lily's favorite, vanilla with strawberry frosting." Mrs. Carter blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this, not after she had called the police on them. Emily seemed to sense her hesitation and quickly added, "I know the party was a little noisy. I just wanted to say we're really sorry if it disturbed you. We didn't mean to bother anyone." For a moment, Mrs. Carter didn't know what to say. She looked at the cake, then back at Emily's warm expression. Finally, she let out a small sigh and nodded. "Thank you," she said, taking the plate carefully. "That's very kind of you." Emily smiled. "Lily had a great day. We just wanted to share a little bit of it with you." Mrs. Carter looked down at the cake, her heart feeling unexpectedly warm. Maybe, just maybe, she had been too quick to judge. She gave a small nod, stepping back inside. As Emily walked away, Mrs. Carter sat down at her table, looking at the sweet pink frosted slice in front of her. She picked up the fork, took a small bite, and let out a slow breath. It was delicious, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so alone. Mrs. Carter sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the half-eaten slice of cake on her plate. The sweet taste still lingered on her tongue. But what surprised her most wasn't the flavor. It was the simple kindness behind the gesture. She had called the police on them, yet here they were, offering her a piece of their happiness. She sighed, tapping her fingers against the table. For years, she had kept to herself, watching from behind her curtains, feeling like the neighborhood was slipping away from her. But had she ever tried to be a part of it? Had she ever really given the new families a chance? A soft giggle outside pulled her attention back to the window. She stood up and peeked through the curtains once again. Lily was playing with a small group of children, running in circles with a bright pink balloon in her hands. Her laughter was light, joyful, completely innocent. Mrs. Carter found herself smiling without even realizing it. Just then, there was another knock at her door. She hesitated but slowly walked over and opened it. This time, it wasn't Emily. It was Mark. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter," he said in a polite, steady voice. He held 2 cups of coffee in his hands and extended one toward her. "Thought you might like some company." Mrs. Carter hesitated, looking at the cup. She hadn't spoken to Mark much since he moved in. She had known he was an FBI agent, but beyond that, she had never made an effort to learn more. She sighed and stepped back, opening the door wider. "I suppose I can spare a few minutes," she said, trying to sound casual. Mark smiled and stepped inside. He handed her the coffee and took a seat at the table, glancing at the cake still sitting there. "Good cake, huh?" he asked, taking a sip from his cup. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. "It is," she admitted. Then, after a pause, she added, "I suppose I might have overreacted today." Mark chuckled. "It happens. But I get it. Change isn't always easy." She sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I've lived in this neighborhood for almost 30 years. It used to be so quiet. I knew everyone. Now it feels like I don't belong anymore." Mark leaned back slightly. "You still belong, Mrs. Carter. But maybe you just need to let people in." He glanced toward the window, where the sounds of laughter and music still carried through the air. "These families aren't trying to take anything away from you. They're just making memories, the same way you probably did when you were younger." Mrs. Carter was quiet for a long moment. Then she let out a small chuckle. "I suppose I've been a bit stubborn," she admitted. Mark grinned. A little. For the first time in years, Mrs. Carter didn't feel like an outsider. She took another bite of cake, sipped her coffee, and for the first time, truly listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. And somehow, they didn't seem so bad anymore. As the evening settled in, the party in Mark's backyard slowly began to wind down. Parents gathered their children, saying their goodbyes while Lily ran around, hugging her friends. The once loud laughter turned into soft murmurs as guests began to leave, carrying balloons and leftover cake. The warm glow of string lights flickered gently, casting a cozy atmosphere over the yard. Mrs. Carter sat at her kitchen table, still sipping the coffee Mark had brought her. It had been years since she had shared a conversation like this with a neighbor. Somehow it felt nice. She looked at Mark, who sat across from her, relaxed and comfortable as if they had been friends for a long time. "You know," she said, tapping her fingers lightly on the coffee cup, "I never had children of my own, but I used to love watching the neighborhood kids play when I was younger." Mark nodded, listening intently. "Sounds like you cared about this place a lot." Mrs. Carter sighed. "I did. Still do, I suppose. But when the old neighbors moved away, everything started changing so fast. New families, new faces. I guess I just didn't know where I fit in anymore." Mark leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I understand that feeling," he said. "When I retired from field duty, I felt the same way. I had spent years chasing criminals, always on the move, always working. Then suddenly, I was just a grandfather trying to figure out how to plan a 5-year-old's birthday party." Mrs. Carter chuckled softly. "I imagine that was quite the change." Mark grinned. "It was. But then I realized something. Just because things change doesn't mean they're worse. They're just different. And sometimes, different can be good." Mrs. Carter looked out the window again. The party was nearly over, but she could still hear Lily's little giggles as she ran around the yard. The sound didn't bother her anymore. In fact, it felt oddly comforting. She took a deep breath. "Maybe I've been too quick to judge," she admitted. Mark smiled. "It's never too late to start fresh." Just then, a small knock came from the door. Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow and stood up, opening it to find Emily and Lily standing outside. Lily held a small plate in her tiny hands, covered with a napkin. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," Emily said warmly. "We had some extra cupcakes and thought you might like one." Lily held out the plate with a bright smile. "It's strawberry, my favorite." Mrs. Carter looked at the little girl, then at the plate in her hands. Her heart softened. She smiled, really smiled, for the first time in a long while. "Well, I do like strawberry," she said, accepting the plate. Lily beamed. "Yay, maybe next time you can come to my party too." Mrs. Carter chuckled. "Maybe I will." And just like that, the wall she had built around herself began to crumble. The night had grown quiet, and the last of the party guests had left. The decorations still hung in Mark's backyard, gently swaying in the evening breeze. Inside, Emily was cleaning up, stacking plates and wrapping leftover cake. Mark stood by the window, looking out at the neighborhood. It felt peaceful now, but something had changed. Across the fence, Mrs. Carter sat on her porch, holding the small plate with the strawberry cupcake Lily had given her. The house that once felt too quiet, too empty, now felt different, warmer. As she took a bite, she smiled to herself. It was sweet, not just the cake, but the moment itself. For years, she had kept herself distant, believing that she no longer belonged. But today, something had shifted. The kindness Mark and his family had shown her made her realize she had been pushing people away for no real reason. The neighborhood hadn't turned against her. She had just been too stubborn to let it in. She looked up when she heard soft footsteps approaching. Mark was walking toward the fence, a relaxed smile on his face. "Not bad, huh?" he asked, nodding toward the cupcake. Mrs. Carter chuckled. "I'll admit, it's pretty good." Mark leaned against the fence. "You know, Lily's been talking about how much she loves the big oak tree in your yard. Says it's the perfect spot for reading." Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly are you suggesting?" Mark grinned. "Well, if you're up for it, maybe one day she could come over and read under the tree. She'd love that." Mrs. Carter looked at him carefully, then glanced toward her yard. That old oak tree had been there for decades, standing tall as the neighborhood changed around it. She had always enjoyed sitting under it, reading a good book in the shade. The idea of sharing that space with Lily didn't sound so bad. She let out a small sigh, but this time, it wasn't out of frustration. It was something closer to relief. "I suppose that wouldn't be the worst idea," she said, pretending to sound reluctant. Mark laughed. "That's the spirit." The two stood there for a moment, enjoying the cool night air. It was a small change, but it was a start. As Mark turned to head back inside, Mrs. Carter called after him, "Tell Lily I'll have a book ready for her next time." Mark nodded. "I will." Inside, Lily was already fast asleep, dreaming of her wonderful birthday. Emily smiled as she tucked her daughter in, grateful that the day had ended on such a happy note. And across the fence, Mrs. Carter sat on her porch, watching the stars, feeling lighter than she had in years. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just watching the neighborhood. She was finally part of it again.